Thank you for joining, everyone. We're going to give it a minute to let people enter the webinar, but we'll be starting very soon. All right, I think we have a pretty good crowd with us now. So just to get everyone started, my name is Shelley Chowdhury, and I'm a research associate here at the Environmental Law Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's webinar on equity-centered local climate action planning. This is a program sponsored by the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network, or LGEN, which manages under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This event is also co-sponsored by our wonderful partners, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, and the American Bar Association Environment, Energy, and Resources section. At the conclusion of today's panel presentations, we will have some time for a quick Q&A. So please be sure to ask our fantastic panelists your questions. You do not need to worry about holding on to them for the end. Feel free to submit your questions at any point during today's program using Zoom's Q&A function, and we will be able to see them. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you to our outstanding panelists and moderators for joining us today, Emerson Institute for Public Law. At Georgetown University, Climate Fellow at the Georgetown Climate Center, and I see they're getting some freezing. Sorry about that.
Everyone, I see that we have some technical issues over here. Shell, are you able to? All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Harris. I'll step in while Shella addresses the technological problems we have on our end. So we're going to get started. Just give me a moment here while I pull up our presentation here. All right. So thank you everyone for your patience, and we want to thank our audience, especially for your patience this morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone, as well as our wonderful presenters and our co-sponsors. As Shella mentioned, we have ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. My name is Cynthia Harris with the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network and the Environmental Law Institute, speaking to you from the fair city of San Diego and the unceded lands of the Kumeyaay Nation to welcome you to this webinar kicking off LGEN's new Climate Equity for Local Governments initiative, providing local governments with tools for integrating equity in climate action planning and ensuring we account for our most vulnerable populations. Now, we're very fortunate to have 4 wonderful experts on these issues here with us today. I'm going to start with a I promise, very rapid introduction to climate action planning, and then I'll turn it over to Jennifer Lee, followed by a Q&A of all our panelists. So as Cheryl mentioned, please send in those questions. Now, starting off, it really is at the local level where we can have a lot of impact. Local government officials and staff can identify climate impacts specific to that locality. It might be flooding and heat, it might be wildfires, and they can engage in a real dialogue with residents. They're the first responders, and they possess powerful tools like zoning ordinances and building codes. Now, this might be familiar also to some of you because climate action plans, or CAPs, are how local governments address climate change in a very comprehensive manner. And they come in 3 different flavors: mitigation, how do we reduce emissions to prevent climate impacts; adaptation, we know we're going to experience impacts, how do we handle that; and sustainability plans, incorporating both concepts and going beyond. Now, here's a snapshot of the typical CAP planning process and what most CAPs include. This is probably very familiar to many of you, and I won't read it off, I promise, but looking at this, we have to ask ourselves, where does equity come in? And that's going to be the focus today. And we have to ask ourselves, starting off, what do we mean by equity anyway? Do we have substantive actions, process, ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table in climate planning? Now, more and more local governments are using tools like EJ Screen in developing robust stakeholder engagement processes and coming to terms with this legacy of systemic racism that's baked into our cities and towns' very infrastructure and layout. But many populations that are especially vulnerable to climate impacts are still being overlooked because they're vulnerable or they're invisible even to mapping tools, or because they lack a voice, or they just aren't being listened to. For example, physically or mentally disabled individuals, the unhoused, the elderly, children, non-English speakers, outdoor workers, and more. And we also need to address the negative consequences of implementing climate plans. That's why many cities are working on a just transition, you probably heard of the term, and phasing out jobs in high greenhouse gas emitting sectors, or preventing displacement resulting from managed retreat, climate gentrification, and loss of affordable housing. And with that, we are going to set the stage. We're going to turn to our experts and bring in our wonderful slate of presenters, starting with Jennifer. Jennifer, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Let me try to share screen. I don't, thank you. And I apologize in advance if you hear a spaceship sounding device behind me. They've decided to repave the roads over my apartment right at this moment. So if you can all see that, thank you again to Cynthia and Shayla and ELI for organizing this important program. And I'm really looking forward to having a robust Q&A and discussion with the other panelists and learning from you all. So I have been tasked with the wonderful kind of the mandate of setting the stage for the conversation today. And I'll try not to be too much of a Debbie Downer, but my research and practice areas are really focused on the intersections of human rights, community development, and climate adaptation. And for me, the question always starts and ends with, who are we serving and what's at stake? Essentially, what are we doing and who are we doing it for? And of course, I realize that it is impossible to capture the enormity of that question in 10 minutes, to humanize the faces of climate change. I think in a time when I think we can all appreciate it has been very difficult to not become desensitized to every type of disaster, including climate change. But I thought what I might do today is to help focus the conversation by providing a few examples of how climate change impacts is hitting people on the ground in a very real way across the country. And of course, acknowledging that not everyone is experiencing climate change in the same way, to the same degree. So I'll be talking a little bit about the exacerbating factors that force some communities to experience those climate change impacts the first and the hardest, or what we call frontline communities. And I think the best way to do that, at least for me, as someone who lives and works in Washington, D.C., is to provide a case study here in our nation's capital. I think D.C. is a good example of how multiple multiples of those exacerbating factors have converged with climate impacts, but also how a city is also trying to proactively and more equitably include community members in that process. And then I like to end in what I hope will be some food for thought for climate practitioners, even if it's not entirely intuitive, is to kind of poke holes and reframe this ideal of resilience for us. And it's a preview of an upcoming panel that I'm organizing for the National Adaptation Forum later this fall. So I'm not going to talk about the IPCC or the National Climate Assessment and what the data shows, but I think pictures speak 1,000 words, and the photos from this slide have been literally pulled from the headlines. I think they show the range and the scale of climate impacts across the country and the different ways that they have hit the different corners of America, whether it's drought or wildfire, communities literally floating away, as you see with that house in the bottom in the Outer Banks, or roads that buckle under extreme heat or are damaged by repetitive flooding, forcing a lot of local government officials to make very hard decisions about where they build or have to move infrastructure. And of course, the people standing in the cars are actually here in Washington, D.C. from a storm in 2019, right on Canal Street. And I want to kind of end by focusing your attention on the lower left photo. That is a photo that many of you may be familiar with. It's of Ile de Jean Charles in Terrebonne Parish in Louisiana, about 80 miles south of New Orleans. And that is a strip of land that has shrunk about 98% due to subsidence and erosion in the last few decades. And the state is spending nearly $50 million to resettle about 20 families there. And I should note that most of the residents who are remaining are indigenous and come from tribes who were forced to relocate there in the 19th century from the mainland after the passage of the Indian Removal Act. And yet again, they are now being forced to relocate. And Ile de Jean Charles is just one example of how frontline communities in the United States are grappling with climate change. But because of our focus here on municipalities, I want to use the urban context as one example of frontline communities and kind of cumulative impacts. So structurally, I think, as many of us are familiar with, our cities were built to be segregated, whether it's where we place highways or where we concentrate households based on their race through redlining. Today, it's those same households that are being disproportionately bearing the impacts of climate change. And to use redlining and heat as an example, a 2020 study showed that 94% of redlined areas today are experiencing higher temperatures than non-redlined, affluent, and more white communities due to proximity to highways, more paved surfaces that trap and release heat, and a lack of tree canopies that can help absorb that heat. And so what you see here is a New York Times very visually compelling interactive they did in their coverage of that report that shows the redlined neighborhoods in the city of Richmond and the urban heat effect. And very often, as we know, in those same populations, there's a lack of transportation, there's food deserts, people have to travel farther to get to work, to get to school, to get to grocery stores. And so, of course, the impacts there are cumulative. So I promised I would turn to DC. So I'm not going to zoom in on purpose because I think you can see the trends here, and I'll just walk you through them from left to right. The first map here represents the racial segregation in Washington, D.C., which was once known as Chocolate City. The majority of the city's Black population today is concentrated east of the Anacostia River. And you will see those areas in the right diamond. It's in dark green shaded. The city of Washington, D.C. is divided geographically by wards, and wards 7 and 8 are the ones that you see are predominantly Black and also low income. The second map shows the concentration of our food deserts. That vast geographic area in Ward 7 and 8 has 3 grocery stores. To give you a sense of comparison, I live approximately in the middle of the city, and I can access 5 grocery stores within 15 minutes of walking range. The third map shows income levels and disparities in the region, red being the lowest income households. And the final map shows the health burdens from air pollution. This is a study that came out a few years ago as well, where some neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. and their residents experience more than 4 times as many pollution-related premature deaths as compared to wealthier neighborhoods. And the pollution has to do with, of course, where the cities decide to build highways and thoroughfares, have many congested corridors, and where they placed a lot of industrial facilities. Research has also shown, and I don't have a map to represent this unfortunately, but that these same communities also pay the highest in energy costs relative to their income, and where the temperature differences can vary as much as 18 degrees because of the urban heat island effect. So again, I don't need to zoom in on this map for you to understand the trends. I know that Darby and Matt and Luis will be talking about what cities are doing, so I'll just try to close the loop and end on a semi-optimistic note for Washington, D.C. by giving an example of what we're doing to be proactive on planning. So in 2016, the district's climate adaptation plan identified the Watts Branch tributary, which you see in the little red box there, which is just off the Anacostia River. And the residents there are living in some of the most flood vulnerable areas. You know, remember the maps from the previous slide that shows that this area of the city is also one of the most under-resourced in Ward 7, oops. And that's also due to some of the social economic indicators that you see here. So to help implement the 2016 climate adaptation plan, the district then convened a working group of residents. This is a photo of one of our meetings who live in that Watts Branch neighborhood. They aptly named it the Equity Advisory Group. And we met for just a little under over a year to crosswalk the community residents' priorities with the city's climate priorities. Sorry, I keep doing that. And this was supported by a number of resource partners, including Georgetown, as you see from a photo of me there taking notes. And what we did there was identified, or the residents more aptly identified, that climate change was not among their top priorities. That is not a surprise to anyone, I think. Jobs, public safety, schools, access to metro, access to grocery stores, hospitals were top of the list. And so in an effort to kind of thread the needle, it culminated in 3 sets of interrelated recommendations, 1 for resilience hubs and 2 for workforce development programs for adults and youth. So stage 2 of this process consisted of the district partnering with the residents to implement those recommendations, starting with the resilience hubs. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, resilience hubs are essentially community centers that are housed within existing trusted community spaces like a church or a library or a school. And the idea is that these places can be neighborhood gathering places before, during, and after disaster. And as part of the continued partnership, DC will provide rooftop solar to the Resilience Hub, which will be housed in a community enrichment center at a local nonprofit. And with the Georgetown University Law Center providing legal support to the Resilience Hub community members. And so I provide that as an example of where the city has partnered with multiple stakeholders and has centered the residents in not only the planning, but operationalizing and vision gathering of what started out as a climate-based concept, but is meant to be something that will enhance the total resilience of the community. And I will end by contradicting myself just a little bit. So this is an article that was written by Ashley Shelton last year. She is the president of the Power Coalition for Equality and Justice based in Louisiana. And the idea of her article is essentially resilience has become the new buzzword, I think, among climate practitioners, as in that is what we are striving for, right? It has been equity and now it is resilience. And so she really explored this idea of why is it that the same communities in this country are being asked over and over again to be resilient? And I think that's a question that's really worth exploring, I think, for all of us. And that is something that we'll be exploring at an upcoming program in October. And I think some of the questions we'd like to explore, and maybe our food for thought for this group, is does the concept of resilience, however we define it, accurately reflect individual or community goals today? What resources do we need to pivot the focus from resilience as a stopgap to more permanent solutions for these community members? And what should be prioritized in post-disaster recovery to make sure that these communities are made whole again and not just restored to where they were before the fact? So on that very optimistic note, I'm going to turn it back to Cynthia. Cynthia, I don't think we can hear you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I have an adjunct professor at the Harrison Institute. Now we'll turn to Darby, who is Director of the Climate and Environmental Programs at the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. Darby?
Wonderful. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well, Darby.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So thanks, Cynthia and everyone. I'm really honored to be here. Again, my name is Darby Berry. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the director of the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. And for those of you who aren't aware, I'm sure there are many on this call, but the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative, we've been around for quite some time. We were established in 2011, and we are a network for public agencies primarily to share expertise, leverage resources, and advance comprehensive solutions to facilitate climate action planning. Today, we have expanded our network quite a bit. We work both with academia, nonprofit organizations, business and community leaders, in addition to our public agencies, to really raise the profile of climate leadership through education, sharing best practices, and both localizing our research. So our mission is to sustain regional impact. So the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative, we cover all 4,200 square miles of San Diego County. For those of you who aren't familiar, San Diego County is in Southern California. We have 70 miles of coastline. We have both these beautiful coastal deserts, we have mountains, and we have inland, very warm deserts. We also share an international border. So we are along the US-Mexican border. The port of San Ysidro, which is the border crossing between San Diego and Tijuana, is one of the busiest car transportation border crossings in the world. So, we do have a really dynamic region. But I think it's really important to talk about, who we are as an organization. So, our mission is very simple. It is to connect the region to advance climate change solutions that both mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. We do this by envisioning a region that is prosperous and resilient, and we recognize that we cannot get to prosperous and resilience without an equitable and unified approach to our work. So I just give that little bit of background so folks know kind of who I am and what I do on a day-to-day basis. But, to really sustain this regional impact, we do this through a couple of different pathways. The first is by building regional capacity. So we really work to give, city planners, urban planners, people who are working in the public sustainability sector, as well as their counterparts in academia and nonprofit, the right tools to be addressing climate action. So in the past, we worked a lot on greenhouse gas inventories. How do we do climate action plans? And now I'm, excited to share that 18 of our 19 jurisdictions in the San Diego region have adopted climate action plans. Many of those are actually on their second iteration of updates. So, really trying to create a snowball effect of we're not inventing the wheel over and over again, but we're giving people the tools to keep it moving. We also elevate regional leadership. So, the San Diego region, we are no strangers to climate action. We actually experienced two of the worst wildfires in California's history back in 2003 and 2007, which really spurred a lot of intuition and climate work in the San Diego region early on. The city of Chula Vista is actually one of the first cities in the nation, which is in southern San Diego County, to adopt a formal climate action plan. So, we're no stranger to this, but we really want to continue to work and elevate that leadership that we've had for more than a decade. We also leverage strategic partnerships. So the organization that I run is very small. We only have 2 full-time staff and quite a few very nimble graduate students who provide their research and expertise to us. But so we can't do it alone. So we really try to leverage those strategic partnerships. We'd love to work closely with EIL here as well. And so really trying to see, who's the expert in these spaces and how can we bring them in instead of everyone needing to be, informed all the time. And then the most important thing that we do, which is actually what I'm going to focus a bit on today, is we really emphasize regionally responsive research. So recognizing that climate action requires us to sometimes be reactive, but how do we get ahead of that? So not just being proactive, but being responsive to those regional needs and providing the research and data that folks need to really move the needle. So for those of you who aren't familiar with San Diego County, I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about, the climate impacts that we're facing here and why it's so important for us. So the fourth climate assessment for California revealed that by the end of the 21st century, San Diego can expect that temperature will increase. We're seeing increases in our heat days, heat wave frequency, as well as intensity and duration. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with Southern California, most of our residents here, myself included, do not have air conditioning in our apartments, units, homes. It's just not the norm. So thinking about how that is an impact is really important for us. Sea level rise, again, we have 70 plus miles of coastline, beautiful beaches. They're also a massive economic impact to our community. Many people know about Southern California's beautiful beaches. So sea level rise, having about 3 feet, as well as increasing flood events. We can see in the new 2030 decade that those increased nuisance flooding, so our king tides events, are going to go up. That means we're losing parking lots, losing access to our beaches and public spaces. Precipitation is also going to remain completely variable. So San Diego County actually currently has the highest rate of variability in rainfall of any other county in the contiguous 48. That means when we have really, really wet years and our really, really dry years, the predictability between them is really challenging. So that's only going to increase. So we're still going to struggle with really wet years and really dry years, but predicting those is going to get harder and harder. Also, the intensity of storms is going to increase. And our public infrastructure here is made for dry Southern California. So those really intense storms, not the best for us. As well as increased wildfire and risk in drought. In San Diego, we have actually 4 wildfire seasons, meaning all year round. Wildfire threat is imminent and possible. I say that because today we're talking about equity, and Jen alluded to it in her presentation, but when we talk to the community and we talk to them about climate change, extreme heat is not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind for folks. The first thing that comes to mind is housing affordability and also, what comes with that. So when we take this into an equity-based context, I think that is really important. I think it also, for local planners and city planners, it really gives us a lot more power to understand how we can tackle these problems in a very new and systematic way that's going to actually give people resources and have positive health impacts. So I just wanted to extrapolate some of these climate impacts as they apply to the San Diego region and probably many others. So when we have more frequent extreme heat days, people who can't afford AC, don't have AC like myself, and don't have access to cooling centers or these resilience hubs that Jen identified, those are really challenging. It also really hinders our vulnerable populations. So thinking about the elderly, our youth populations, not all of our schools here in San Diego have air conditioning, as well as our unhomed population. So thinking about how they are being impacted and what that public health crisis is. With precipitation, we see impacts to water quality in our food systems. It also leaves our unhomed population extremely vulnerable to vector-borne illnesses at different times. Sea level rise causes coastal displacement and coastal erosion. It also causes inaccess to public spaces, so public access to beaches, which, just to tie it back, are frequently seen as a heat refuge here in San Diego. So if there's no parking lot for the beach, or there's no way for us to access it, because a lot of San Diego beaches have very high cliffs, so you need a staircase to get down. How are we going to be, thinking about those as they intersect with equity as well? And with wildfire, the WHO has access to recovery and aid after a wildfire. This also causes air pollution. So San Diego has a very big, agriculture and farming industry in our region. So We also see this air pollution impact on our, essential and outdoor workers who don't have the, financial means to take time off of work to, not be out there. So they're putting themselves at risk. So I really want us to, continue to think about that climate impacts are important for us to plan for, but they just simply exacerbate existing inequities. It just makes life a lot harder. So that responsive research that I mentioned before, I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the journey that the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative has done with our partners. So the San Diego Association of Governments, that's our regional metropolitan planning organization here in San Diego for transit. They were awarded a state climate action planning grant, and SDRCC was a partner on that. So in 2019 and 2020, we conducted a regional adaptation needs assessment, which involved over 80 interviews to understand why aren't we moving on adaptation. San Diego has made such great strides in climate action planning, looking at our greenhouse gases and mitigation specifically, but why not adaptation? So, we really worked to kind of think about this. And the biggest thing that came out of that was people felt that they didn't have the right tools to do adaptation equitably. So this led SDRCC to develop an equity first approach to climate adaptation planning document. So I will definitely share that with folks after I'm done talking. But we followed the state adaptation planning guide, which here in California has 4 phases, which is the planning, explore, vulnerability, defining strategies, and then implement and monitor. And we decided to add a phase 0 that intersects along all 4 of these phases. And this phase is an equity first approach. So I just want to reiterate, the reason behind this is that building a strong equity first foundation for climate adaptation planning begins with recognizing the historical harms and structural and institutional systems that are the root causes of social and racial inequities. Some people don't think that this is related to climate, but it absolutely is. It is at the core of how we are going to plan and actually implement solutions that build a resilient community. So the way that we did this through an equity first approach was to pull it back and look at the 4 pillars of equity and how they intersect with different elements of the climate adaptation planning process. So the first was we looked at procedural equity and tried to find ideas of how people within the planning process can relate to each of these pillars to then try to find solutions to adapt them. So, procedural equity relates to that perception of fairness, who's allowed to participate and whose decisions hold weight. So the need to be influenced by culture, so having culturally responsive practices, all of these things are involved in our procedural equity space. The next is structural or recognition. These terms can be interchanged throughout different academia, but this is really looking at what are the underlying biases that might be present in the work that you're doing. This is safety, so thinking about, do people actually want to come to these presentations because they feel safe? I've heard about some cities putting cooling zones at police stations. Is that safe for everyone? Big question. Another one is distributive equity. So this is also the perceived fairness of resources. This is really important when we're thinking about being reactive after a disaster. Who has access? Also transportation and mobility. Here in San Diego, this is a big concern when we think about wildfires and evacuation route. Who has access to these things? And we're thinking not single car homes. And the last is that interactional equity. So what are the power dynamics that already exist in structures that we need to address? How are we being socially sensitive to those who may not be able to, attend safely? So thinking about our undocumented individuals or our unhomed individuals or parents who need childcare, how are they being, addressed in this interactional space to feel that they're capable of being present? So when we do this with the climate adaptation planning process, we need to consider equity across the dimensions of those climate impacts that I mentioned before. So this is in the anticipation of shocks, so those one-time big events, and then also anticipation of long-term stressors. So number of heat days, energy overuse, long-term pollution. This is also important after and during a disaster. So both evacuation and then also rehoming and rehabilitation. And then we also need to acknowledge that adaptation and mitigation cannot live in silos. They really do play within each other, and that our mitigation efforts are adaptation efforts. And so I just want to leave with also, this is a regional approach that we're taking here. We recognize that both equity issues and climate impacts do not care where jurisdictional boundaries end or start. But a lot of our municipal planning systems only create opportunities for people to plan within their small local jurisdiction. So really thinking about how we're moving these shocks and stressors beyond that and on a regional scale that's actually going to build, to a resilience effort. It's also important to think about not just the planning side of things that are responsible for this, but what are those multi-sector initiatives and strong partnerships that should be at the table and also at the responsibility end. So that's my last slide, and I will leave it with that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Darby. That's terrific. Next, we'll turn to Matt, who's the former Chief of Sustainability with the City of Cleveland, Ohio. I know we can make a rock and roll joke here. And he's also the current VP of programs at the Student Conservation Association. Matt, I'll give you a second to cue that up.
Okay, great. Can you see everything okay? Awesome. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. Let's move quickly to the next slide. So I'm, I guess I'm wearing those two hats today. My current hat, which is Senior VP of Program at Student Conservation Association. This is my only slide on that, but our job really is more in helping cities implement their climate action plans and other plans. So we really do focus on resilience, especially with that connection to youth development and green jobs. So you can see the stars here represent the cities where we are actively have a good amount of programming. We are, a national leader in youth service and stewardship. We were the first conservation or climate corps all the way back 65 years ago, developed by Liz Putnam. And this year we're putting our 100,000th member into service, which is really exciting. And I'm one of those alum. Actually, when I was 17, I had my first really outdoor experience through SCA and completely transformed my life. So just really understanding, I really personally understand the impact that this type of experience can have on youth and their professional development. Just quickly, this is our 2019 data. I'm using this because this is the closest thing to what we're doing this year. Given the pandemic, we did drop the last couple of years in terms of youth engaged in conservation. But this is about the numbers we're going to have in 2022. So looking to expand in these cities, but also into new cities, and just because there is so much need out there in engaging youth in climate and getting more green jobs. I'm so happy to talk more in the Q&A about this or afterwards with anyone, but I will now turn to the other hat, my old hat, as a Chief of Sustainability with the City of Cleveland. As in that role, I led development of our first climate action plan, and then also this updated kind of version 2.0 from a few years ago. So I really want to focus more on the process, I would say, for developing this CAP. In terms of the overall goal, working with nearly 100 key stakeholders represented from almost every key organization in the city, jointly developed really these main goals, which is improving outcomes in health, access to green jobs, resiliency, and engagement through equitable climate action, planning and implementation. So Cynthia mentioned earlier the type of CAPs out there. We realized early that we wanted to put both adaptation and mitigation into one plan. I've always had a lot of trouble disconnecting the two. Basically any action to me in climate there's often some mitigation and some adaptation or resilience component, and pretty much always an equity element to it. So we decided early on to bring both mitigation and adaptation together. So you can see on the right, a lot of the areas where most CAPs have, right, around energy, green building, transportation, water, green space, waste, food, et cetera. I'm not going to really talk about those today. What I really want to focus more on are the cross-cutting priorities, because in reality, that is where we spend the most of our time in developing this climate action plan. So these are those 4 cross-cutting priorities that were developed. We had working groups established for each of these 4, and we also have separate appendices in the plan for each of these 4. So I can give you the URL later, but all of these are online at sustainablecleveland.org. You know, our first plan was fine. It was one of those early climate action plans that were very technical in nature, right? It was really about greenhouse gases. We're going to analyze our carbon pollution, and we're going to look at some cost-effective ways to reduce our carbon pollution in the city. What it lacked was, I think, connecting more directly to other citywide priorities, especially in a city like Cleveland, that is now the poorest city in the country. It has, you know, just tons and tons of challenges that it's had for decades. So that's one piece, and it also lacked the engagement part. So I think what we tried to correct in this process was building much more, right, in these cross-cutting priorities, and especially on the engagement piece with the community. So on the social and racial equity, we did develop a racial equity tool to analyze every single action in this plan. There ended up being 107 total in about 28 objective areas. So I'll talk more about that. Green jobs, workforce development. We created basically a baseline methodology for monitoring the impacts of over time of CAP implementation and the impact that would have on jobs locally. And we took our crack at, you know, defining green jobs through what the available data that was there. But I think it was very informative just going through the exercise of where those jobs were locally and how climate action can connect directly. Climate resilience, you know, we had this climate and vulnerability assessment. I think in some ways, you know, seeing Jennifer's description of DC, you know, similar in that way. It's really bringing together kind of the social factors with the climate impacts, and then through that process, identifying the most vulnerable populations in the city. So we have a larger analysis there on climate resilience. And then finally, business leadership surfaced as well. So using publicly available data, we looked at all the local corporations and essentially analyzed their environmental and social governance performance and put that in a report to just kind of share out which ones maybe were performing and which local companies maybe weren't doing as much. From my personal experience, I always thought that was, compared to maybe some other cities, some of the larger Cleveland companies did not connect as much to climate work as other areas. So just kind of like really getting some data beyond that and seeing who's helping more and maybe who hasn't really connected. So those are the cross-cutting priorities we focused on. I mean, connected to all of that was the engagement piece. So we devoted significant amount of time to the engagement part, especially resident engagement. We held 12 neighborhood workshops, really focused mostly in our underserved communities, both historically and at that time presently. We provided great local food specifically from that neighborhood. You know, we've provided really a connection to the work that I think we hadn't done before. So these workshops were structured in a way that, you know, they really started out with identifying from those residents the great things about those neighborhoods from their perspective, some of the challenges, some of the things people really want to address through actions in the plan. But at the same time, we didn't want to leave it there. So these workshops are also focused on supporting resident-led neighborhood-based projects in those communities that people were passionate about and just wanted to take more direct ownership over. So we had this Cleveland Climate Action Fund where we basically provided a one-to-one match for projects working with a group called IOB, stands for In Our Backyard, IOB.org. So IOB supported residents in developing projects, really provided free support, and also really crowdfunding for some of those projects. And then we provided a match on top of that to make those a reality. And it was really cool. In the end, we got, from out of these 12 workshops, got over 20 projects received match dollars through this Climate Action Fund. And so you can just see a few examples down here at the bottom. The largest food pantry actually in Ohio. We funded solar to put on that food pantry, as well as electrical upgrades for safety, but also to allow solar in the first place. Open Streets, Cleveland, connecting to alternative transportation, provided some additional funding for them to do some more open streets events. And then projects like this one on the bottom right, the Mothership Connection, is through a group called Birthing Beautiful Communities, which is really, I'd say, a village of birth workers or doulas who provide support to pregnant women at high risk for infant mortality. And what they were asking for was really, how do we provide transportation more regularly? So we helped support was, 2 hybrid vans to help transport all those who are involved with birthing beautiful communities. And it was just, a great project, and just a really benefit of engaging a wide variety of people. These are projects we would have never come up with, right? It's just our staff would have never thought of these things. But through this process of engagement, we could, one, see what people care about, and then connect that reality to climate, and to make the connection between, again, sustainability and people's priorities in the neighborhoods. I mentioned this tool. This was really helpful. It's not a crazy tool. It's very qualitative, not quantitative. There's all sorts of racial equity tools out there. And this one built off some of best practices from GARE. You can see the logo on the bottom right. They have a lot of wonderful resources online, so recommend checking them out. But we decided to do more of this kind of qualitative tool to assess all of our actions around language, really data and accountability, who is disproportionately impacted by these different actions. Are they advancing or not economic opportunity? And then the engagement piece, who is or again is not being engaged in any particular action. And this, I think was really really amazing for us to go through this process. We learned a ton. Just a couple examples, I think we had an action early on that was really solely focused on reducing food waste, which we all know is important. Through this process, through like really reviewing the priorities in the community and what was coming up in workshops, we changed that really to focus on hunger. So it was, reducing food waste and hunger was how that whole objective area focused on. So I'll, for sake of time, I'll stop there. But we developed this tool. It's online. Feel free to check it out. This is my last slide. I just kind of want to sum up, some of the lessons learned going through this process. I'll just say equity and engagement, investing in both. Most of our funding for this CAP development went to these two things actually, and not the technical piece. So I just would encourage you, as you look to funders, maybe to support this, or just within the city or government, just right up front say we can't do this well without putting actual resources into these things. Partnering technical experts and local trusted organizations, which is also often the same thing. We worked with the Racial Equity Institute around racial equity training for every single stakeholder in this process. So we provided free racial equity training through this. IOB I mentioned. Brown Flynn helped with the ESG analysis. So great partnering. Just summing up again, don't just ask community members for input and leave it at that. There needs to be follow-up. And in our process, we thought it was great to provide actual funding for resident-led projects. Trust the process. I think it's easy to go into these kind of thinking what's going to result, but really trusting that process and listening, I think, does result in a different CAP. Supporting all key stakeholders and bringing that equity lens to the process. I mentioned this training we provided. It was great for the plan itself to provide racial equity training for all 100-ish stakeholders, but it also was just great for the community, for all these organizations to now have these employees working on this. And then the regional piece, Darby talked to. There are limitations to what we can do in one municipality. So the best climate action work is done regionally as much as possible. Any climate action you look at, it does not stop at the city line. So I'll stop there and thank you very much. Here's my contact info.
Thank you so much, Matt. And with that, I'm happy to say we'll be transitioning things over to Louise. So Louise, if you'd like to take over. Louise joins us from the Community for a Better Environment.
Great, thank you. I can get my slides on the screen really quickly.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Martinez, and I am the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Enhancement Intern, or CARE for short, with Communities for a Better Environment, CBE. And I work in Wilmington, California, which is a Los Angeles neighborhood, and it's also where I grew up. So in my position with CBE, I have engaged with community members in the form of surveys and mutual aid events in an effort to learn how folks from Wilmington want to build a resilient neighborhood for themselves and their families as climate impacts, industrial impacts, affects the health and lives of Wilmington residents. So one of the main projects I'm currently carrying out revolves around the creation of resilience hubs in Wilmington that would be hosted by trusted community centers and clinics. And so I also create curriculum, right, that has educated folks on these industries that surround the neighborhood, along with how increasing climate emergencies create cumulative impacts in the community. So with that, I'm excited to talk to y'all today about community and climate resilience in Wilmington, California, and what that means for me. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I stated earlier, Wilmington is a community that experiences cumulative impacts. So from 5 surrounding refineries, hundreds of oil wells peppered throughout the neighborhood, and increasing climate events caused by climate change. So these impacts include poor air quality and heat islands, which affect community members by causing asthma, bloody nose, heat exhaustion, and even cancer. And the root causes of these impacts go back to colonialism, imperialism, since those structures have allowed the fossil fuel industry to invade environmental justice communities like Wilmington. Next slide, please. So as a result, while community members become empowered to fight fossil fuel industries and advocate for their phase out, they also seek to build community resilience and adaptation until that goal of phase out is seen through. So these images are of us holding events at local community spaces around the neighborhood. And in these events, we have distributed a survey that we created that we call our Resilience Hub survey. We have raffle prizes that we distributed, and also what we call resilience kits. And the resilience kits on the picture to the right, you can see them being created. They contain first aid supplies and personal protective equipment. And the raffle prizes have also ranged from backpacks to what are called life straws that allow someone to drink water from it since it has a filter. And our team of community members who facilitated these events and distributed these materials, we called them the CARE team or the CARE squad. And they consisted of a multi-generational team of 5 of us, including myself, who supported each other in the creation of these kits and the survey. Next slide, please. So the main goal of our survey that we conducted last summer of 2021 was meant to identify 2 things. 1, where this resilience hub should be, and 2, what it should offer. And on top of this, we also wanted to know how close folks live near the industry, how far they would be willing to walk to a resilience center, and what they do during power outages. So we wanted to know all of these different ways that folks in the community react to climate events and how they react to power outages. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these are some of our results here that indicate age, indicate whether they have dependents, whether how close their family lives in proximity to industry, where they go during emergencies, and the impacts that are most concerning to them, right? So if you notice here, there is a good spread of all ages since we surveyed over 100 families. Over half of them do have dependents, and most of these families live at least within 5 miles of industry. And at the most, they live right next to industry. I've seen a house that has an oil well right next to it, churches, oil wells right next to it, right? Parks, oil wells in the parks, right? So, and on the top of these impacts of concern which is a huge concern for all Californians really, is earthquakes. And for EJ communities, earthquakes are especially concerning since a big earthquake can really damage refinery infrastructure, can really damage oil drilling infrastructure, industry infrastructure, which could further pollute, further contaminate air quality, water quality, and et cetera. Next slide, please. So this part of the survey here, we see what services and materials community members of Wilmington would like to see at the Resilience Hub. And as you can see here, that includes earthquake kits, Wi-Fi, food and water, supportive staff, right? So although there's not a guarantee that a Resilience Hub can contain all of these resources, but it is my responsibility, along with CVEs, that as we continue to reach out to community centers and local clinics in Wilmington to build out these resilience centers, we have to make sure that the voices of community members and their energy priorities are represented in a way where what they need as a community will for sure be implemented into the center. And this also includes continuing to involve multi-generational community members like the folks that we had in our care team. And also we want to establish just a huge network of resilience centers as well in Wilmington as we continue to reach out to community centers and clinics, so that if there's a center that is lacking something, folks can go to a center that has that resource. Or if there's a center that's further away, but there's one also closer, folks can go to whichever's closer to them, right? Next slide, please. Great, so how can environmental justice communities be supported in their fight for safe and equitable neighborhoods? And I think that we need to understand a couple of things. The first being that adaptation and resilience is not to stop climate change, but it's part of the process, right? And we need to support community-based solutions, such as advocating alongside them for their solutions, which include the phase out of extraction of natural resources, the phase out of fossil fuels in their neighborhoods. And that's because if it's not a solution for low-income environmental justice communities, right, then it's not a real solution. And then it also includes using local and state seats of office to support the work that frontline communities have been engaging in for decades, really. And along with that support comes a solidarity with these communities and advocating alongside with them for their solution of fossil fuel phase out in their neighborhoods. And that's also prioritizing community engagement, because we can't know how resilience and other solutions to climate change looks like without engaging with the needs of the community. We can't forget that moms, right, grandmas, fathers, and other members are experts in what their neighborhood needs to be healthy, safe, and equitable for themselves and their families. So adaptation is the process. The solution is phase out, and funding for communities, funding for community-based organizations that are on the front line will help them see through their resilience goals until the real solution of fossil fuel phase out is achieved. Thank you. Pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Louise. This is terrific. And I'll note that we are running almost at the hour because this is obviously a very weighty issue. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to absorb. So for those of you who can, hopefully our panelists can stay a few extra minutes just to take some of these questions. And really appreciate the panelists for engaging so thoughtfully with our audience in the chat and in the Q&A. One that I really would like to hear from all of you, and this is a great question, is how does your organization, or actually how does a local government create these relationships with the community, especially if there is a trust factor, if it's a low income, community color, and there are those systemic factors that Jennifer and everyone was talking about. Who wants to take this one first? All right, Louise.
Yeah, so the CD has had an office in 4 neighborhoods for about 20 years in California. So for Wilmington, for example, they've had an office there for many, many years. And they're constantly engaging in community, right? Their office is in the community. There's even staff members that are from the community, including myself. So I think it takes a long time of bringing on folks who are from the community, who are experts on what their neighborhood needs, and really just trying to engage with everyone in that community and share solutions, share concerns, right? To really build that trust out. But it does take a long time because, yeah, we are an organization, right? Some folks may not know what we're about initially, so it does take time to build trust for sure.
Thank you so much for that answer, Louise. So I'm seeing that Cynthia is having a bit of a connection issue. I'm happy to jump in and give you all the next question. So one that is of particular interest to me actually came to us through the chat. It asks, with an increase in the need for mental health services over the past 2 years, how do you see services being incorporated and made more available to affected communities in the future from the private equity arm of community development? And please feel free, any of our panelists, to jump in on that. I know it's a large one that's not quite been touched upon yet.
I feel like that's a highly specific example, and I'll just fill the silence by saying that I haven't seen, I mean, I think that says a lot, right? Like I haven't seen specialized attention to mental health services from the private equity arm, if from the private sector, if that's what the question is asking, though that should not at all minimize the fact that that should be a frontline focus for all climate practitioners.
Thank you, Jennifer. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that one before we move into the next one?
I can just add, with this transition that we're working to encourage folks to look at climate impacts as something that is exacerbating underlying conditions within communities and recognizing the, historical and structural harms that have been caused to many communities, as these are just going to be amplified. We're also looking at, how do we bring in a public health lens into climate and pulling it. So I think it's also about that climate planning is not just for traditional climate practitioners. And so as we build out those multi-sector approaches, and in theory, this should come to the forefront, but agreed with Jen, it's not something that I've looked at specifically, but it's absolutely an important issue, and I appreciate the question.
Thank you, Darby. Cynthia, we just addressed a question that came to us in the chat on mental health services, but you're free to take it from here.
Yeah, I think we wrap with just a couple of quick questions on what the role of cities are and what the limitations of cities are, because that's a significant question. Sometimes we need to partner, as Darby mentioned, it's a regional approach. You have to partner also with state, federal, and tribal government. So just curious if any of our panelists have anything on that, maybe Matt, from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, in my old role, felt a lot of limitations in terms of what the city alone can accomplish. So that regional collaboration is absolutely critical. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I mean, the other piece I guess I'll add is that increasingly, I think city government's role is as a convener and facilitator. It is uniquely in some ways positioned to serve as that more independent, neutral party to bring together all these different stakeholders that come up with joint solutions. So that's kind of softer approach than maybe a lot of governments are used to historically. But if you're not doing that convening in a real authentic way, then the impacts are going to be limited.
And I just want to fill in because there's also a comment, or there's also a question in the Q&A about how do you mobilize this regional approach and what is that? Because I think it is related, to what Matt is saying, is that there is historically this, infrastructure for cities to be that convening, but I think it's really important for cities to recognize that they don't necessarily get to deserve that role from the community without building a lot of those layers of trust from the historically disadvantaged communities who have been kept out of those programming. And then I'll say, as this relates to a regional role, thinking about how you can work together with folks who are tackling these same challenges. I'll also share that the Climate Collaborative specifically, that was actually the impetus for our forming, was that some folks from cities who were early on in the climate action planning didn't really have a network or resources to tap into. So they decided to kind of create one on their own. And how that has evolved has really helped accelerate, I think, the timeline for other cities to see it and jump on, because that peer pressure of cities being ahead, particularly in climate, is really important these days. But I think it is important to recognize that those all relate to a lot of these underlying historical norms, and that cities need to do a lot of the labor that is costly and intensive to actually start creating it as a safe convening for our communities.
There's a question here, because as we wrap up, just a couple more on success working with the private sector to help fund. Darby, you just mentioned this is expensive work if you want to do it right. And I'll mention that there's federal resources, FEMA, HUD, et cetera. There are state resources. We don't have a national framework, unfortunately. And some cities are even starting to levy some form of property tax to fund some of these climate efforts. But I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts, ideas, whether government agency sources or if it's private sources. Jennifer?
Sorry, I feel like the student who isn't doing my homework. I am trying to respond to another question in the chat box at the same time. So could you repeat that question? Or maybe give it to someone else. I'm trying to answer.
Yeah, I can take a quick crack. So it's really looking
does
at
anyone have any creative ideas on? Yeah, thank you, Matt.
Yeah, we actually ended up when I was with the city and actually started before me. We actually worked with a separate nonprofit entity to allow us to fundraise for the larger Sustainable Cleveland Initiative, because it's folks in local government, it's very difficult to take money and accept it and then spend it in any easy kind of way. So we were able to partner with this, where we were able to get at least small pockets of money from local corporations, place-based foundations, and then use that to support, I think, pretty deep engagement efforts with the community. So that was one tactic we used as key. But I would definitely look at we used a Partners for Places grant for our CAP and got pretty good amount of funding to support the equity and engagement piece. And then, of course, increasingly in terms of implementation of the infrastructure bill, and a lot of the federal money coming down is a huge opportunity that I did not have when I was in my position. So do not lose sight of, for a lot of cities, the increased resources that are available.
Wonderful. Given time, I'm just going to ask for a quick round robin for folks to give one takeaway, if you can think of a single takeaway. I know there's a lot here for our audience you want them to leave with today. If we could do an order of, actually do reverse order from presentation. So Luis, do you have a takeaway?
Yeah, I think my takeaway is community-based solutions are climate solutions, are real climate solutions.
Wonderful. Matt?
Yeah, I think my big takeaway is around just kind of a big tent philosophy in terms of engagement, and really having climate be all stakeholders' responsibility, but also climate practitioners, their responsibility is also these other topics that the larger community, has deep caring about. So that's it.
Thank you, Matt. Darby, a last word for our audience.
Yeah, I think, a reminder that adaptation is a privilege, and therefore looking at it from that underlying example of who has not been afforded privilege is really important if we're going to be tackling this, because to have that foresight is a deep privilege. And so with climate impacts looming on all of our communities, we need to recognize those who have been unafforded privilege over time are going to be most impacted.
Thank you so much, Darby. And Jennifer, final word of wisdom.
Big ask. I think it is, to reinforce, I think what a lot has been said today, a lot of the issues that contribute to frontline communities being the most vulnerable to climate change impacts is not because of climate change or environmental injustice alone. It is because of a bunch of other issues. And so in order to kind of not take a whack-a-mole approach to addressing climate change impacts and hazards, I think we have to think very holistically about the cross-cutting resources and options at the table, and then making sure that community members are at the table as well to help prioritize them from the ground up and not from the top down.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, as well as Darby, Matt, and Louise, for a very candid discussion of how climate change exacerbates existing inequities, how local governments can begin to acknowledge and address those inequities in their climate planning. And again, this is obviously a serious issue, and I do hope our audience leaves both informed and inspired. We greatly appreciate everyone for attending our session today, for staying a bit over these really terrific questions that have come in, as well as our co-sponsors, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and ABA CEER. And we encourage you to check out their websites for resources and upcoming events as well. And to you, our audience, please do, again, take advantage of these resources, reach out to our experts if they're amenable, and we'll be posting this presentation on the LGENE website. And please do stay tuned for the continuation of this series. This is just the beginning. We'll be looking at how climate impacts specific populations, many of those addressed today, at public health considerations and how to avoid those unintended consequences and maladaptive practices. And of course, check out lgene.net for a wealth of resources on how local and tribal governments can meet their federal environmental obligations from water to soil to air. And of course, the inevitable plug to connect with us on social media as well. Thank you so much. And back to you, Shella.
Yes, thank you all so much. As Cynthia said, we do hope you will visit our other resources and keep an eye out for our future events. Another huge thank you to our panelists, Louise, Matt, Jennifer, and Darby. And with that, thanks for staying a little late with us, and have a wonderful day, everyone.